Welcome to Johnny Carson Files. On this video, Johnny Carson is about to introduce his oldest friend on live television. But what Tim Conway whispers into the microphone will make Johnny collapse forward, face in his hands, shoulders shaking, unable to speak for the first time in 23 years of hosting. And the secret behind that moment? It was something Johnny did decades ago, something he'd completely forgotten, that saved Tim Conway's life. You will not believe what happens next. But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us.
When Tim Conway walked out from behind the curtain on The Tonight Show stage on March the 7th, 1978, the studio audience erupted. 300 people on their feet, cheering, laughing before he even said a word. Because that was the thing about Tim Conway. He never just walked onto a stage. He stumbled. He shuffled. He bumped into the curtain on his way out. The audience was already gasping with laughter by the time he reached Johnny Carson's desk. Johnny stood, grinning ear to ear, hand extended for the shake. Tim shook it. And then he leaned toward the microphone and said something so quietly that even Johnny almost didn't catch it. 3 words. Johnny's smile disappeared. His hand dropped. His face went pale. And for the next 47 seconds, an eternity on live television, Johnny Carson said absolutely nothing. The king of late night, the man who had never lost his composure in front of a camera, sat frozen. The studio orchestra stopped. Ed McMahon half rose from his chair, confused and alarmed. Producers in the control room were shouting into headsets. Nobody understood what was happening, because nobody in that studio, not the producers, not the audience, not even Ed, knew what Tim Conway had just whispered. Nobody knew about the night in 1963 that had bound these 2 men together in silence for 15 years. Nobody knew that Tim Conway had carried a secret so heavy it had nearly destroyed him. And nobody knew that Johnny Carson was the reason Tim Conway was still alive to stand on that stage at all. What Tim whispered that night would change everything America thought it knew about the funniest man in the country. And it all started on the worst night of Tim Conway's life. March 1963. Cleveland, Ohio. Timothy Daniel Conway was 29 years old, and by every external measure, his life was finally beginning to work. He'd landed a supporting role on the McHale's Navy television series, his first real break after years of grinding through local television in Cleveland. The checks were coming in. His name was starting to appear in the trade publications. People were beginning to recognize him on the street. But nobody saw what was happening behind the doors of his apartment on Euclid Avenue. His marriage was fracturing under the weight of pressures Tim had never learned how to talk about. A childhood defined by strict expectations and the unspoken rule that men did not show weakness had left him without the tools to ask for help. He was performing joy for everyone around him. Colleagues, producers, and the audience at home, while something inside him was quietly going dark. Tim had one ritual that kept him anchored. Every weekday night, he turned on The Tonight Show, not for entertainment, not out of habit. He watched it because Johnny Carson made him believe the world still had lightness in it, even when everything around him felt heavy. Johnny's timing, his warmth, the way he could make any guest feel genuinely seen. Tim studied it the way a drowning man studies the shore. But there was one night in the late summer of 1963 when even the television wasn't enough. Tim sat alone in his apartment, the screen casting blue light across the walls, and made a decision he had never spoken aloud to anyone in the 15 years that followed. He was done. He had decided. He wrote 2 letters, folded them, set them on the kitchen table, and then he turned the television on one last time. Not for any particular reason, just because the silence was unbearable. The Tonight Show was on. Johnny Carson was 47 minutes into his monologue, doing a bit about a Midwestern state fair that was going completely sideways in the best possible way. The audience was in stitches. Johnny kept the straight face. He added one more detail, then one more, and the whole thing collapsed into absurdity, so perfectly constructed that Tim Conway, sitting alone in his apartment with 2 folded letters on his kitchen table, laughed so hard he fell sideways off his couch. He lay on the floor, laughing until tears were running down his face. And when the laughter finally faded, he looked at the ceiling for a long time. He got up. He picked up the 2 letters. He tore them in half, then in quarters. He threw them away. He never told anyone, not for 15 years. But what nobody knew was that the story was about to get even more extraordinary. Because on March 7th, 1978, Tim Conway had not come to The Tonight Show to be funny. He had come to tell the truth. March 7th, 1978. NBC Studios, Burbank. The Tonight Show was taping at 5:30 p.m. for broadcast that night at 11:30. Tim Conway arrived at 4:40 p.m., nearly an hour earlier than his call time. The makeup artist noticed. The stage manager noticed. Ed McMahon definitely noticed. Tim sat in the green room with a cup of coffee he didn't drink, turning something over and over in his hands. A crumpled, yellowed piece of paper. Something he had kept in the back of his desk drawer for 15 years. At 5:10 p.m., Tim walked to Johnny's dressing room and knocked twice. Johnny opened the door. He looked at Tim's face, and his expression shifted immediately. He stepped back without a word and let Tim inside. They sat in the dressing room for 18 minutes. The stage manager knocked twice during that time. Both times, Johnny said the same thing through the closed door. "Give us a minute." Nobody on the crew had ever heard Johnny Carson ask for more time before a show. Not once. Not in 15 years. When they finally emerged, Johnny's eyes were red at the edges. Tim Conway was very quiet, and the show's producer, a man named Fred Dordova, who had seen everything in 30 years of television, said something he would repeat in interviews for the rest of his career. I looked at both of them walking out of that dressing room, and I thought, something just happened in there that I will never fully understand. The show began at 5:30 p.m. Exactly. Johnny's monologue was technically flawless. The timing was perfect. The jokes landed. The audience laughed in exactly the right places. But Ed McMahon, sitting to Johnny's left for the 15th year running, knowing Johnny's rhythms better than almost anyone alive, could see that something was different. Johnny kept glancing toward the wings. His right hand, resting on the desk, was not entirely still. Ed leaned in during the first commercial break. "Johnny, you all right?" Johnny looked at him. "In about 20 minutes, Ed. Something's going to happen on this stage that's never happened before. I need you to just let it go. Don't cut to commercial. Don't do anything. Just let it happen." Ed started to ask why. "Trust me," Johnny said, and the cameras went back on. At 6:08 p.m., Ed McMahon's voice filled the studio. "Ladies and gentlemen, you know him from The Carol Burnett Show, from McHale's Navy, from every variety program that has dared to let him near a camera. Please welcome the funniest man on television, Tim Conway." The audience erupted. Tim shuffled out from behind the curtain. He walked into the set piece that had been placed near the entrance, walked directly into it, staggered back, looked at it with profound betrayal. And the audience was already doubled over before he reached the desk. He and Johnny shook hands. Tim sat down. He looked at the audience with that famous expression, the one that seemed to say he was mildly confused about how he had ended up in this chair, on this stage, in this life. The audience laughed at the expression alone. Johnny leaned forward, smiling. "Tim, it's great to have you." And Tim Conway leaned toward the microphone. He said 3 words. "Johnny, thank you." Not a setup, not a bit, not a punchline waiting to happen. Just 3 words, said quietly, with an earnestness that was so unlike Tim Conway's public persona that it took a moment for the audience to register that something had shifted. Johnny heard it, and Johnny went still. 47 seconds of silence on live national television. The orchestra had stopped. Ed McMahon had risen slightly from his chair. Producers were talking urgently into headsets. 300 people in the studio audience sat frozen, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Johnny Carson's head dropped slowly forward. His hands pressed flat against the desk. His shoulders were shaking. A camera operator, a man named Dale Hutchins, who had worked at The Tonight Show for 11 years, said afterward that he had zoomed in on Johnny's face without being directed to, purely on instinct. What he saw through the viewfinder was something he had never seen in 11 years of watching Johnny Carson on a monitor. Johnny Carson was crying, not the dignified, controlled emotion that occasionally surfaced during serious interviews. Not the graceful glisten that came when something genuinely moved him. This was something rawer than that. His face was down, his hand was over his mouth, and his shoulders were shaking the way a person's shoulders shake when they have been holding something in for a very long time. Tim Conway did not reach for a joke. He did not break the tension. He sat across from Johnny and waited, and his own eyes were wet. Finally, Johnny lifted his head. He looked at Tim. He looked at the camera. He looked at the 300 faces in the studio, all of them waiting. And Johnny Carson said something into the microphone that would be replayed on television for the next 40 years. "I'm sorry. Give me just a second. I wasn't ready." What happened next has never been fully told until now. Johnny reached under his desk. He pulled out a glass of water and drank from it slowly. He was buying himself 30 seconds to become Johnny Carson again. Then he looked at Tim Conway with an expression that everyone in that studio recognized as something genuine and rare. Not the warm professionalism he deployed for every guest, but the look one old friend gives another when they have just been handed something they didn't know they needed. "Tim," Johnny said, his voice steady now, but different from his usual tone. "Do you want to tell them why you're thanking me?" Tim Conway looked at the audience, then at the camera, then back at Johnny. He took a breath that was audible through the microphone. "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for 15 years, Tim said, "so I'm just going to say it." The studio was completely quiet. The funniest man on television was not being funny, and somehow that silence was more compelling than any punchline he had ever delivered. In 1963, I was in a very dark place, Tim said quietly. I mean that literally. I was in my apartment, lights off. I had made a decision that I wasn't going to get to the next morning. The audience inhaled as one. I turned the TV on, I don't even know why. And Johnny was doing this bit about a state fair. I don't remember exactly what it was, and I laughed so hard I fell off my couch. Just completely wiped out. Couldn't breathe. Tim paused. He was holding the crumpled yellow paper between his hands. And I thought, if the world still has moments like that in it, then I want to see what the next one is. He looked at Johnny. You didn't know you were doing it. You were just doing your job. But I was the audience that night, Johnny, and your job saved my life. The studio did not applaud. Not immediately, because what had just happened was too large for applause. 300 people sat in the particular silence that descends when something true has been said in public. The kind of truth that takes up all the oxygen in a room. Johnny was looking at his desk. His jaw was tight. His eyes were closed. When he opened them, he turned to face Tim Conway directly. I need to tell you something, Johnny said. And I need to tell you this in front of everyone, because that's the only way it means what it should mean. He paused. I know exactly what bit you're talking about. Tim blinked. The state fair piece, August of '63. The one where the pig got loose. A startled laugh moved through the audience. Tim Conway's face shifted, something between recognition and astonishment. I remember that night, Johnny continued, because it was one of the worst nights I had at that show in the first year. The prepared material wasn't landing. I was terrified. The network had been making noises all week about whether the show had the right host. I was sitting behind that desk thinking, this is the last year. They're going to replace me, and they're going to be right to do it. He looked at Tim. And then I just let go of all of it. I stopped thinking about the network. I stopped thinking about the ratings. I just did the bit the way I wanted to do it. And the audience responded. And for the first time all week, I remembered why I wanted to do this. Johnny's voice was quiet. I went home that night, and I called my brother, and I said, I think I can actually do this job. That was the night I stopped thinking about quitting. The silence in the studio deepened. I was saving my own life that night, Tim, and without knowing it, neither one of us knowing it, we were saving each other's. Nobody moved. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, a woman began to cry, not quietly. The sound broke open something in the room, and within seconds it had spread through the studio the way a sound spreads through water. Concentric rings of it, moving outward until it reached every corner. Ed McMahon had his hand pressed over his eyes. The camera operators were not bothering to wipe their faces. And Tim Conway, the man who had spent 20 years making the world laugh, who had built an entire career on the premise that nothing needed to be taken seriously, sat across from Johnny Carson with tears running openly down his face, and he was not trying to stop them. 22 million people, Johnny said, turning to face the camera. That's how many people watch this show every night. And every single night, every night. I tell myself the same thing. You don't know who's watching. You don't know who's in that audience. You don't know what that person needed to hear tonight. He looked at Tim. Now I know. At least once, 15 years ago, I know. What Tim Conway did next was the moment that producers would later call the most unexpected thing that had ever happened on The Tonight Show. He reached out and set the crumpled yellow paper on Johnny's desk. "I want you to have that," Tim said. Johnny looked at it without touching it. "What is it?" "It's the bit," Tim said. "The State Fair piece. I wrote down everything I remembered of it the next morning, and I kept it. I've had it in my desk for 15 years. Johnny stared at it. "I don't remember it well enough to have written it down myself," he said quietly. "I know," Tim said. "That's why I kept it. So one of us would." Johnny picked up the paper. He held it carefully, the way you hold something that is simultaneously fragile and impossibly heavy. Then he folded it and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. "I'll keep it there," Johnny said. "That's where it belongs," Tim said. The Tonight Show ran 17 minutes over its scheduled runtime that night. NBC received no complaints. The switchboard was overwhelmed by 11:50 p.m. Before the broadcast had even ended on the East Coast. By midnight, every line in the building was busy. By 6 a.m. the next morning, the calls were still coming in. Not from fans of Tim Conway or fans of Johnny Carson specifically. From people who had their own version of that August night in 1963. People who had been alone in a dark apartment and found their way back through something small and unexpected and impossible to predict. Mental health crisis lines across the country reported a significant increase in calls in the 48 hours following the broadcast. Not from people in crisis, from people who wanted to talk about the thing that had pulled them back from one. The producers of the Carol Burnett Show said that Tim Conway arrived at rehearsal 2 days later, changed in a way they couldn't precisely describe. Harvey Korman, Tim's closest friend on the show, the man who had famously been unable to keep a straight face through any sketch Tim was in, pulled Tim aside before rehearsal and held him by the shoulders. "I saw the broadcast," Harvey said. "I know," Tim said. "Are you all right?" "I think so," Tim said. "For the first time in a long time. I think so." Johnny Carson kept the crumpled yellow paper. He kept it in the inside pocket of his jacket for the next 3 weeks, until his wife noticed and asked about it. He told her the story. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "So you saved each other," she said. "Without knowing it," Johnny said. "Yeah, that's how it usually works," she said. After 3 weeks, Johnny moved the paper from his jacket pocket to a small wooden box in his home office. The same box where he kept things that mattered to him privately, things that were not for public consumption or professional display. A photograph, a letter, a folded piece of paper that held the outline of a bit about a state fair that a young comedian had written down the morning after it saved his life. Tim Conway went on to win 4 Emmy Awards. He spent 35 more years making the world laugh. In interviews, he was almost always asked the same questions about his chemistry with Harvey Korman, about the sketches that had gone sideways on live television, about the physical comedy that had become his signature. He answered all of them with warmth and generosity, and the particular self-deprecation that had always been his armor. He almost never spoke publicly about March 7th, 1978. But in a 2009 interview, conducted quietly for a small publication without cameras, he was asked what he considered the most important moment of his career. The interviewer expected an answer about the Carol Burnett show, or about McHale's Navy, or about one of the Emmy wins. Tim was quiet for a moment. "There was a night in 1978 when I told the truth on television," he said. "Everything before that night, I was performing. Everything after it, I was real. That's the most important thing that ever happened to me professionally. And it had nothing to do with being funny." He paused. "It had everything to do with being honest." Johnny Carson retired from The Tonight Show in 1992. In the weeks that followed, tributes came from every direction, from presidents, from celebrities, from journalists, from the thousands of ordinary people who had grown up with his face as the last face they saw before sleep. The accolades were enormous and largely focused on what he had built: the show, the format, the career, the legacy. But in a quiet interview conducted a few months after his retirement, a reporter asked Johnny Carson what he considered the single most important broadcast of his 30-year career. He didn't hesitate. "March 7th, 1978, he said. "Tim Conway came on the show and told the truth. And the truth turned out to be something that connected to millions of people who had never told their own truth to anyone." He paused. "I spent 30 years trying to make people laugh. That night, we did something bigger than making them laugh. We reminded them that they weren't alone, and that's the whole job. That's what the job is actually for." Tim Conway passed away on May 14th, 2019. He was 85 years old. Among the tributes that followed, the one that drew the most attention came from a statement released by Johnny Carson's estate. Quiet, brief, and characteristic of the man who had spent a lifetime saying the most important things in the fewest words. It read, "In 1963, Tim Conway laughed at something Johnny did on television. In 1978, he came back to say thank you. For 60 years, the world laughed with Tim Conway. Tonight, we are grateful that he stayed." On Tim Conway's desk, when his family went through his personal effects, they found a single framed item. Not an Emmy, not a photograph, not a certificate or an award or a memento from any of the shows that had made him famous. It was a printout of a Tonight Show broadcast date, March 7th, 1978. Below it, handwritten in Tim's own hand, 3 words: "I stayed. Thank you." If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person in your life who makes you laugh when nothing else can. The one who shows up on your worst nights without knowing that's what they're doing. The one who has no idea what they mean to you. Tell them. You don't need a television studio. You don't need an audience. You just need to say the words. Because somewhere right now, someone is watching you the way Tim Conway watched Johnny Carson in August of 1963. They are holding on to something small that you gave them without knowing it. They have been carrying it for years. Let them tell you. And when they do, don't look away. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, because this story is reaching people everywhere. And I want to know where the truth is landing, because the most powerful thing any of us can do is stay. And then, when the time is right, go back and say thank you. Where are you watching from? Drop your country, your city, your name in the comments. And if you have someone in your life who kept you going without knowing it, tell us about them. Let's remember them here, together. Asterisk.